There are only 14 mountains on Earth that rise above 8,000 meters. 14 places where the air becomes so thin, so hostile, that the human body starts shutting down the moment you enter. Climbers call it the death zone, a realm where survival isn't measured in days but in hours. Reaching the top of any of those giants is already a rare accomplishment. Thousands have tried, far fewer have succeeded. But one mountain stands apart, darker, colder, far more lethal than the rest. K2, the world's deadliest high peak, a summit so feared that entire years go by without a single human daring to touch it. And when people do try, many never return. On K2, every step is a negotiation with gravity. Every breath is a race against time. And every mistake, and even the smallest one, can turn fatal. Only a few hundred people in all of human history have ever stood on its summit. They call it the Savage Mountain. And today we're going to explore why climbing K2 is often described not as an achievement, but as a death sentence. To understand that reputation, we have to start at the beginning, with the mountain's brutal history and the fatal odds faced by those who try to conquer it. Ready? Let's begin. Back in the 1950s, American mountaineer George Bell summed up K2 in a single brutal sentence. He called it, "It's a savage mountain that tries to kill you." And that wasn't an exaggeration, it was an observation. For decades, K2 carried a fatality rate hovering around 20%, meaning that for every 4 people who celebrated a successful summit, 1 never came back down. Even in recent years, the mountain has shown no mercy. In 2021 alone, 3 more climbers lost their lives on its upper slopes. To put the danger into perspective, there was a time, not long ago, when more human beings had traveled into outer space than had stood on K2's summit. That's how exclusive and how deadly this mountain is. So what exactly makes K2 so ferocious? Why does it kill at a rate unmatched by the other 8,000ers? To understand that, we have to break its danger into 4 unforgiving components: its location, its altitude, its weather, and the extreme technical skill required just to stay alive on its slopes. And the first factor, the one climbers feel long before they ever set foot on the mountain, is its isolation. K2's danger begins long before climbers even touch its slopes. Its very name hints at just how unreachable it is. When British surveyors mapped the region in 1856, they labeled peaks with simple codes, K1, K2, K3, until they could learn what the local communities actually called them. But in this case, no one had a name. The mountain was so remote, so cut off from inhabited valleys, that not a single local villager recognized it. And so, the label K2 stayed. That isolation is still felt today. Reaching base camp requires roughly a week of trekking, not on gentle trails, but across broken rock and heavily crevassed glaciers. Injuries can happen before the climb even begins. Nights are spent in tents, exposed to freezing winds, miles away from any shelter. By comparison, the approach to Everest feels almost civilized, with established paths and warm tea houses marking the way. And then comes the biggest problem of all: rescue. At K2, help is never guaranteed. Helicopters struggle at high altitude, weather windows are unpredictable, and because the mountain sits near a militarized border, only Pakistan's army pilots are allowed to fly in the surrounding airspace. That means delays, long ones. And on a mountain where every hour matters, delays often become tragedies. And once climbers reach K2 itself, they face a second enemy, the deadly altitude. Once climbers finally reach the foot of K2, the second threat rises above them: sheer altitude. K2 stands at 8,611 meters, making it the second highest point on the planet. But what makes it terrifying isn't just the number. It's what happens to the human body above 8,000 meters. At that height, the air simply can't sustain life. Oxygen levels drop so low that the body begins to cannibalize itself just to stay alive. Heart rate spikes, The body pumps out extra red blood cells, non-essential functions shut down. Every breath becomes a conscious effort, and every step demands more energy than the body can replace. Stay too long, and the consequences turn deadly. Climbers risk high-altitude pulmonary edema, fluid flooding the lungs, or high-altitude cerebral edema, where swelling in the brain can lead to confusion, hallucinations, and eventually coma. These conditions strike fast, often without warning, and the higher you climb, the harder it becomes to think clearly enough to make safe decisions. Strength fades, judgment slips, reaction time slows, and on a mountain as unforgiving as K2, that combination has led to countless accidents. But altitude is only one piece of the puzzle, because even if climbers manage to withstand the thin air, they still have to fight an enemy that changes without warning: the weather. Even with modern forecasting tools, K2's weather remains a problem no one has truly solved. The mountain sits farther north than Everest, and that single detail places it directly under the path of the jet stream, a high-speed river of air swirling around the planet. And when the jet stream shifts, K2 feels it instantly. Winds can go from calm to catastrophic in a matter of hours. Winter gusts hit hurricane force, strong enough to rip tents apart or throw climbers off exposed ridgelines like they weigh nothing. Temperatures plunge, storms roll in without warning, and visibility can collapse to zero in minutes. On K2, the sky doesn't just change, it turns hostile. And then there's the avalanche danger. K2's steep faces and unstable ice formations make it especially prone to massive falls of snow and ice. The deadliest example came in 2008. During a crowded summit attempt, an enormous block of ice collapsed high above the Bottleneck, the narrow technical passage near the summit. The falling ice swept away the fixed ropes, leaving climbers trapped in the most dangerous part of the mountain. 11 people died in one of the worst disasters in K2's history. This is the reality of climbing here. The weather doesn't just complicate the mission, it dictates whether you live or die. And yet, even if the skies stay calm, another challenge remains: the technical difficulty of the climb itself, which many consider the true heart of K2's brutality. If the location, altitude, and weather didn't already stack the odds against climbers, K2's terrain seals the deal. Every route on this mountain is hard, brutally hard, and the one considered the standard ascent, the Abruzzi Spur, is still one of the most demanding climbs on Earth. Roughly 3/4 of all summiteers use this line, not because it's gentle, but because the alternatives are even worse. The west and south faces rise in near vertical walls, and the eastern face is so dangerous that no one has ever reached the summit from that side. So the Abruzzi Spur becomes the default, the least lethal option on a mountain with no good choices. Reaching the high camps is an ordeal in itself. From base camp to Camp 3, the slope tilts relentlessly at 60 to 70 degrees. That's hours of front pointing and crampons, burning through energy reserves long before the real challenges even begin. The first major obstacle is House's Chimney, a 100-foot crack in a rock wall that climbers must scale while wearing crampons. It's awkward, exposed, and physically punishing. A technical nightmare in the thin, cold air. Above Camp 2 rises the Black Pyramid, a jagged, towering block of rock nearly 400 meters high, almost 3 times the height of the Great Pyramid of Giza. This section mixes steep rock, brittle ice, and constant exposure. And just when climbers think it's over, they're met with the next trial, a 25-foot vertical ice wall guarding the approach to Camp 3. Camp 3 itself sits on a 30-degree slope, a place where tents tilt, sleep is scarce, and a single slip can send someone sliding thousands of feet. Camp 4 offers flatter ground, but it sits at 8,000 meters inside the death zone, the calm before the storm, because the hardest part of the climb is still ahead. The Bottleneck, a narrow, sharply angled couloir guarding the final ridge. Above it hangs a colossal serac, millions of tons of unstable ice suspended like a loaded trigger. When it falls, it doesn't crumble. It obliterates everything beneath it. The 2008 disaster proved exactly how unforgiving this section can be. And yet, even reaching the summit doesn't mean safety. On K2, the descent is where most tragedies unfold. An estimated 80% of fatalities happen on the way down. By then, climbers are exhausted, starved of oxygen, mentally fogged, and often running on the last scraps of energy they saved for the push upward. The result is predictable and deadly. K2 demands total strength on the ascent and strength that climbers no longer have on the descent. All the dangers we've discussed, the isolation, the altitude, the violent weather, the brutal terrain, they're not theoretical. They've played out in real time, sometimes with devastating consequences. And no moment captures the true brutality of K2 more clearly than what happened in the summer of 2008, a tragedy still remembered as the mountain's darkest day. Over the course of a single summit push, 11 climbers from multiple international teams died, and 3 more were critically injured. It began on August 1st. After waiting through the entire month of July for a weather window, roughly 30 climbers from several expeditions launched their summit bid. According to Dutch climber Wilco van Rooyen, who survived the ordeal, the first signs of trouble appeared high on the route, about 350 meters below the summit, when the fixed lines were found displaced, likely by a team that had climbed just ahead of them. Hours were spent realigning the ropes. Some climbers lost confidence and turned back, but most pushed on. By the time the remaining climbers reached the summit, daylight was already fading, and that's when the mountain tightened its grip. As climbers hurried down in scattered groups, the fastest 10 reached the Bottleneck, that narrow, deadly choke point beneath a towering sérac. Without warning, a massive slab of ice broke loose above them. It killed a Norwegian climber and a Nepali high-altitude worker instantly, and swept away large portions of the fixed ropes. Everyone still above was now trapped in the most dangerous section of the mountain, left to descend unprotected. Van Rooyen reached the Bottleneck later, descending with Irish climber Gerard McDonnell and Italian climber Marco Confortola. With no ropes, no visibility, and no safe route, they were forced to bivouac overnight, sitting in snow at extreme altitude with no sleeping bags, no food, and no water. By sunrise, clouds had swallowed the mountain. They could no longer see the route or each other. What followed was a desperate, solitary fight for survival. Hands and feet froze in the cold, eyes burned from the blinding reflection of the snow. One wrong step meant death. McDonnell, the first Irish climber ever to summit K2, never made it down. Confortola managed to call his brother by satellite phone. His voice trembled as he described his condition, hands shriveled, toes turning black from frostbite. "Like descending into hell," he said. Van Rooyen, disoriented and frostbitten, eventually staggered down the mountain alone. On August 4th, after days of chaos, Pakistan Army helicopters managed to extract him and fellow Dutch climber Cas van de Gevel, the only 2 who could be reached safely. The human toll was staggering. The 11 climbers who died came from Korea, Nepal, Pakistan, France, Ireland, Serbia, and Norway. By the time the storms cleared, the death toll had surpassed every previous disaster. And tragically, it wasn't without precedent. K2 had taken 7 lives in a storm in 1995, 13 more in 1986, and dozens over the decades since its first ascent in 1954. K2 doesn't forgive mistakes. It never has. And yet, against all odds, climbers continue to return, because in recent years, something unexpected has begun to change on this mountain. Despite its brutal history, the last decade has brought a noticeable shift on K2, not because the mountain has softened, but because the climbing world around it has changed. Expeditions today come with bigger budgets, Most climbers find themselves shelling out somewhere in the ballpark of $35,000 to $60,000 for a full K2 expedition, allowing teams to hire more Sherpas, establish more reliable rope lines, and organize logistics with a level of precision that simply didn't exist in earlier eras. And the numbers reflect that shift. Successful summits, once rare and sporadic, have surged. In 2022, K2 shattered every previous record. A mountain that had never seen more than 62 summits in a single year suddenly saw over 190. And on July 22, 2022, something once unimaginable happened. 145 climbers reached the top within just 24 hours. Those statistics explain why earlier climbers used to say that more people had been to space than to K2's summit, and why that statement is no longer true. The mountain that once saw only a handful of successes per year now sees crowded summit days. But here's the important truth. K2 didn't become safer because it changed. It became safer because climbers changed how they approach it. More manpower, more fixed lines, more commercial support, more everything. The mountain itself, though, remains exactly what it has always been. When the weather turns, when the seracs shift, when the jet stream drops, K2 still rules with absolute authority. And that's the paradox of this peak. Increased access doesn't make it any less savage. Ultimately, K2 continues to stand as a reminder that even in an age of modern gear and organized expeditions, there are still places on Earth where nature sets the term and always will. No matter how advanced the gear becomes, no matter how many ropes are fixed or how many Sherpas guide the way, K2 keeps its reputation intact. It is still the Savage Mountain, a place where skill, strength, judgment, and sheer luck all have to line up perfectly just to survive the attempt. Climbers can prepare for months, even years. They can study the weather, train their bodies, memorize every section of the route. But K2 has a long history of humbling anyone who approaches it without absolute respect. A single lapse, a sudden shift in the jet stream, one crack echoing through the seracs. That's all it takes. Because on this mountain, nature holds the final word. And when the skies align in its favor, K2 becomes exactly what it has always been, a ruler with no rivals, a peak that tolerates no arrogance, and a reminder that some places on Earth remain untamed and unconquerable in spirit.